Hi, I'm Russ Feingold, President of the American Constitution Society, a legal organization in the United States that strongly supports death penalty abolition. I'm honored to speak with you and wish I could be there now, but I'm looking forward to being in person for most of the conference. I was asked to speak about the political dynamics of the death penalty in the United States, which is an outlier among its close allies in its continued use of the death penalty. However, it's not entirely accurate to say that the United States is pro-death penalty. The death penalty in the United States is largely a state issue. The federal death row population makes up less than 2% of the total death row population in the country. And at the state level, perspectives on the death penalty differ greatly. Case in point, 50% of executions in the United States come from just 2% of counties, which are predominantly in the South and Southwest, including Arizona, Oklahoma, and Texas. Now, I've worked my entire political career in support of death penalty abolition. I spent 18 years representing the state of Wisconsin in the United States Senate and was consistently the most outspoken senator against the death penalty. And yet, in only one of my elections, did an opponent try to use my position against me, and they did so without success. This is consistent with the death penalty rarely having an electoral impact, particularly on federal elections. As a senator, I refused to vote for any legislation that expanded the death penalty and introduced multiple pieces of legislation to abolish the federal death penalty. While the legislation never succeeded, I have seen the political dynamics around the death penalty evolve significantly. Nationally, the death penalty really hit the political scene in the United States in the late 1960s when Richard Nixon made his presidential campaign about being so-called tough on crime, a phrase that continues to have traction in American politics. The tough on crime narrative is part of a broader strategy designed to increase political support among white voters by appealing to racial grievances and anti-black racism. And to be tough on crime meant being very pro-death penalty. Since the 1960s, members of both parties have sought to be seen as tough on crime, or at least not soft on crime. Unfortunately, an example of this was President Clinton's 1994 crime bill, which was Clinton and Democratic senators trying to prove that they were tough on crime. The bill stiffened the penalty for a variety of offenses, particularly drug offenses, and included a vast expansion of the death penalty. The 1994 crime bill has since been blamed for substantially increasing the U.S. prison population and having a disproportionate impact on communities of color. Between the late 1990s and mid-2020, we actually saw momentum build against the death penalty, although 9/11 did slow it down. This general trend showed up in public polling, with decreasing public support for the death penalty. And yet, the death penalty rarely made national news, except in cases where states insisted on killing someone who had legitimate and substantial claims of innocence or in cases of botched executions. The resulting narrative from these higher profile cases has contributed to the momentum against the death penalty. In the United States, 11 of the 23 states that have abolished the death penalty have done so in the past 15 years, including states with Republican legislatures and/or governors. This underscores how the narrative is shifting on the death penalty and the resulting political calculus. Since 2016, national politics have dominated all political discourse in the United States, even at the state and local level. In 2020, President Trump carried out an unprecedented federal execution spree in his final months in office, executing more people in 6 months than the federal government had done over the prior half-century. States with governors or legislatures aligned with Trump took notice of this execution spree, and some are now trying to replicate that spree with state executions. Oklahoma, for instance, has 7 executions scheduled in 2022 alone. This is indicative of the right's continued obsession with being tough on crime and part of the growing macho politics promulgated by factions on the right. Nationally, the Republican Party is in the midst of an identity crisis, and the death penalty is caught up in this. For example, the politics of the recent and ongoing execution sprees are aimed at a very small set of voters who can have outsized influence due to political and electoral dynamics in the United States. This narrow focus also reflects the growing divide within the Republican Party around the issue of the death penalty. People of faith are grappling with what many perceive as an inconsistency in being anti-abortion but pro-death penalty. On this, the Vatican's outspoken opposition to the death penalty has had a real impact in the United States. Overall, the momentum in the United States is towards abolition. 23 states have abolished the death penalty, and 3 more states have moratoriums. Nationally, public support for the death penalty is at historic lows. Since President Biden took office, there has been growing discussion about a blanket commutation for federal death row. These dynamics are partly in reaction to each other. The grotesque inhumanity of executions, and specifically execution sprees, are motivating more people to say enough is enough. On the other hand, the growing abolition movement makes those who still support the death penalty dig in their heels, relying on distorted information to justify their positions and resorting to even more barbaric methods of executions and execution sprees. The politics of the death penalty also increasingly reflect the political dynamics around race in the United States. The death penalty is undeniably racist as implemented in the United States. The roots of the death penalty in this country go back to slavery, lynchings, and white vigilantism. Data demonstrates persistent racism, with the death penalty being disproportionately pursued against black defendants, and with black defendants being disproportionately sentenced to death and executed. Abolishing the death penalty is part of the growing criminal legal reform and racial justice movements in the United States, which are contributing to the momentum towards abolition at the national level and within some states. Contrast this with factions of the right that embrace white supremacy and increasingly engage in intentional race baiting and are very pro-death penalty. I believe the United States will eventually abolish the death penalty, but I also recognize that the last states to retain the death penalty are likely to fight the hardest to keep it. The international dynamics do matter. As the United States works to restore its reputation internationally, the fact that we remain an outlier amongst our close allies in our retention of the death penalty is glaring. So I'm grateful for this event, for this coalition of organizations and partners, and for the opportunity to share and learn from everyone in attendance.